afternoon. I would like to thank both Kay Hoberg and Pedro Mauricio for joining us in this webinar and everyone who's attending it. As you probably know, Kay Hoberg is Professor of Supply Chain and Operations Strategy and Head of Department of Operations and Technology at Kuhn Logistics University. And Pedro Mauricio is the Business Development and Sales Director at Rangel Logistics Solutions. Rangel is our new field prime partner, and we are collaborating with Rangel in a different number of issues. So, without further ado, I would ask Professor Kay Hoberg to start his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Welcome, everyone. So it's a pleasure to talk about one of my pet topics, technology-driven supply chains. We sometimes call it also for supply chain 4.0. And I have to clarify, I'm based in Hamburg, and Kuhn Logistics University is a private business school. And we always have to highlight that we are partly funded by the Kuhn Foundation, but we are not the Kuhn and Nagel University. So we are a university focused on logistics, but we are really engaging with all different types of companies. So in the logistics industry, DHL, Schenker, but also in other industries. So a lot of the talks that I'm giving today is based on a collaboration with McKinsey. And let me start with a quick quote here to get all of us up to speed. So you realize there is this rather successful guy, Elon Musk, at the moment the world's most wealthiest man. And in a rather recent presentation, he said, well, the supply chain stuff is really tricky. And I always find it quite funny because he's so successful there with his cars and other businesses. But supply chain stuff is really tricky. So it's probably for us to solve these challenges. So we probably have to solve all these supply chain challenges. And a lot can be done with technology. So here I brought some pictures of new technologies that are probably reshaping the way we do supply chain management. And so some of that might be familiar. So on the top left, you see the first self-driving truck. Then you see a delivery bot for autonomous delivery that will send parcels to the home. 3D printing, additive manufacturing, that is now being applied in many industries already. Then variables like these order picking variables that have been promoted by a German manufacturer. Or robots in the warehouse. Many are familiar with Kiva that has been bought by Amazon, but there are also competitors like Grey Orange.
Desculpa lá, tens que entrar no Zoom. Entra no link do Zoom.
Somebody talking, so maybe you could mute yourself. Grey Orange order picking butlers. And finally, IBM is driving a lot of innovation around big data and analytics with the Watson platform. So just some examples of many technologies that are around that can reshape supply chain management in the future. So I want to talk about 3 topics in my talk in a bit of detail. I only have 20 minutes. So I really want to talk about supply chain analytics, so how to use data to improve decision-making in supply chain management. What IoT, Internet of Things technologies can do to address supply chain problems, and then talk about supply chain planning and how this planning will be enabled by new technologies, but what are the challenges of the human-machine interaction there in supply chain planning in the future. So a lot of that is really based on our collaboration with McKinsey. I also provide some examples of projects we are currently working on. So let's start with forecasting. So I guess we all know forecasting is the starting point of all planning. Therefore, it's great to have a good forecast. And we are probably beyond the stage where there was no forecasting. Everybody is doing some type of forecasting. And maybe some rather naive type of forecasting, where you assume that last year's demand will be the same in this month, or last week's demand will be similar to this week's demand. That is already providing quite some accuracy. Then all the ERP systems have now some statistical forecasting algorithm in there, moving averages, exponential smoothing, some basic tools that help you to fit some historic demand, some seasonality, and maybe some trend. And with that, we can improve the forecasting accuracy. If we move one step further, there are now many companies implementing demand planning solutions, control tower solutions. So they really try to use all different types of data and are a bit more advanced when it comes to the effects that are incorporated. And then finally, and this is where the world is heading, we are talking about machine learning. So really all these AI, artificial intelligence tools that really take full advantage of big data. So considering all different types of inputs, internet data, promotion data, social media data, and helps you ideally with a digital twin to really understand what is happening there, what is the demand going to be like. And with that, you can really achieve rather good performance, 85% forecasting accuracy and more. And here I brought one example. We've been working with the fashion retailer Zalando. I think that's the #1 in terms of fashion online in Germany and most of Europe. And we try to help them to better plan their warehouse activities. So I was working with the head of logistics through one of his warehouses, and he was complaining that his demand forecast is typically very good because the daily demand forecast is then used to schedule and plan workers in the warehouse. They have quite some volatility there during the week. And he felt that sometimes the forecasts were very bad, and that led to situations where they couldn't send out the goods to the customers, or they had too many workers in the warehouse, which resulted in a loss of productivity. And we helped them to really include all these different variables into their sales forecasting process. Different days, holidays, marketing, time trends, end of month when the people have less money, but also the weather. And what was really interesting for us was the weather. So the temperature, sunshine, and rainfall, because we found that the weather has quite some impact. So actually the impact is very strong. So if you look here at an example of what we found was, if we compare 2 days in Germany, on a German summer weekend, one day with relatively bad weather, so 13 degrees average during the day. So that means roughly 8 degrees at night, 18 degrees during the day, a little bit of sunshine, a little bit of rain, and a rather good day. So 23 degrees average, that's maybe 18 degrees at night and 30 degrees during the day, and sunshine and no rainfall. And you find that there is roughly 20% difference in terms of the customer demand. So customers, if the weather is good in Germany, and that might be different but in Portugal, use the time, if the weather is good, to do stuff outside, but they don't shop online. They don't shop online. And if you talk about the number of employees there, so they roughly had at the time 8,000 people in their warehouses, that would relate to a 20% reduction in the workload of these workers. And now, since we use temperature and sunshine forecasts, which are very good for the next couple of days, they can now much better plan the work in the warehouse. So that's really something they have implemented, and this is working rather well for them. So that's just one example of how this big data can be used to really improve some activities there in the warehouse. Let's look at the second example, Internet of Things technology, IoT. And what is IoT? Well, essentially you have some kind of sensor, you have a little bit of processing power in your device, and you are connected to the internet. And here on the right, there are some examples of stupid IoT applications. So something like a little robot that allows you to play with your pet, or a hairbrush that tells you if you are moving too fast and breaking your hair. So that's nice, but probably we are looking for applications in a supply chain and logistics context. And here's one project with a startup in the US called Tive. And what they've been doing is they have been embedding a GPS location tracker into a very simple device that can be put into a container or a parcel, and that's rather cheap. So we are talking about the device that's really cheap, and if it gets lost, it doesn't matter too much. And the company is promoting that, and it's providing a lot of data, really a lot of data. So location data, temperature data, information about light, so if something is opened or closed, all different kinds of information. But now the question that these companies, the users of this tool have, what do we do with it? The companies are data rich, they have all access to this data, but ultimately they are rather inside secure. We've been discussing what are use cases and how can we really use these devices. So for example, you can improve the estimated time of arrival forecast. You can do a theft protection. You can generate proximity alerts. So if a truck reaches a certain geofence around a warehouse, you get notified, and now you can schedule the bay accordingly. But there are also more strategic use cases, so should be strategic, like process mining. You understand how the goods are routed through the network, how the network is structured, and all different kinds of stuff. So having data is just a starting point. Having IoT data is just a starting point. So you really have to think how to integrate that into your standard processes. A second project I want to quickly mention is a project with a leading coffee manufacturer here in Germany. And here we are using IoT data that is based on technology enabled in their coffee machines. So they have now, what they are doing is they are serving the professional market. So not the end user, the customer, but more bakeries, offices, restaurants. And roughly 1/3 of their coffee machines are now IoT enabled. So each evening, each night, they send home information about the consumption. And so we had the idea, why don't we use that to monitor the usage and to generate reorders to ensure that the coffee machines never run out of coffee. And that's quite convenient because then nobody can forget ordering coffee, so they can continue to sell, and they can really understand the consumption. So we've been working with them, and we have access to some a few thousand of these machines, and we can check what is the consumption data, and this is really used to really trigger automatic replenishment, detect stockouts, but also something like contract compliance. So we've noticed that customers are serving many more drinks than they buy coffee. And based on that, we know that they are buying cheap coffee somewhere else and using the machines essentially for free. Maintenance, scheduling, stock taking, all different types of action. So that's another perhaps quite interesting application area. Cool. And then the third topic I want to quickly mention is that's human-machine interaction in planning. So if you look at planning, there are so many decisions. So we are working with a British retailer there. And if you look at how many decisions are happening there, it's huge. So for example, what they are doing is they have roughly 500 stores. In each store, they have 20,000 different articles. And they want to forecast the demand for these articles on a daily basis for the next 21 days. And if you do that and update the forecast every day, that means that you are generating 210 million forecasts. And obviously, that's nothing you can do manually. So you need a system. Same for replenishment, probably similar for routing. So you have a huge number of forecasts that are automatically generated. But now the question is the system already good enough, or can the human add additional benefit? Because the human knows something that the IT system doesn't know, because the data is not fed in, because the user has local information. He knows about a competitor running a promotion. He knows about a local event that is happening. So, and now the overarching question is, how do you deal with these recommendations that are provided by the decision support system? So if we look at this project we are doing with Blue Yonder, a leader in the AI context, we realize, yes, the machines have a lot of strength. So they have a lot of computing power. They are rather low cost now. They are fully rational. Humans are, well, different, right? They have different strengths. They can use their human judgment. They can improvise. They have tacit knowledge that they don't really, that is not really coded anywhere. And now the question is, how can we best optimize these two stages? How can we use the recommendation of the machine, and how can we leave the final decision to the human? And there are many, many other interesting questions coming out of there. So in the same direction, there is another project with a manufacturing company. Here it's not about forecasting, here it's about ordering. So what is happening there is the system is generating order recommendations. So for example, on June 21st, this planner gets a recommendation from the system, please order 150 tires. So it's a commercial vehicle manufacturer, and we are looking at 5 plants in Germany. And there might also be a second order recommendation, which was, please order 80 of these electric engines. The planner actually ordered 120. And maybe for the screws, the planner followed the recommendation. So now the question is, when should the planner really get the recommendation, and when should this perhaps be automated? Because if you look at planners, they have perhaps better things to do to check the recommendation on 500 screws that are there to order. So we try to understand, when are planners really deviating from the recommendation that's given by the system? And we built a big model with lots of information about the planner, about the product, about the point in time when an order was placed. And then we found that actually there is a lot of potential for automation, because planners, in our case, they only deviate from the recommendation in 6% of the orders. So if a planner has to do 1,000 orders, he only deviates in 60 of these 1,000 orders. 940 of these orders are passed through. And then we thought, let's automate some of that. So, and how much to automate? That's the ultimate question. So we initially said, let's try to automate 50% of the orders. So based on our model, we could probably see quite well when they are deviating. And that means now, if we automate half of that, instead of the planner has to do 500 or 1,000 orders, he's only doing 500 orders. And based on this, we might miss some adjustments. So in our case, 2 out of these 1,000 orders would be different, but that's something the company is probably going to accept, because they save a lot of time. And perhaps if he ordered too little or too late, they can somehow manage to that. So that's really the benefit of automation. So to conclude, and then let's start the discussion. So there's really a lot of potential. There are so many different technologies that can be applied and are not yet applied. So here is my final picture. And we thought about a washing machine and the life cycle of a washing machine, and how supply chain technology can enable you to really improve the way the supply chains operate. And I just want to look at some stages here. So for example, here's the buying stage. Right now, many companies who are offering white goods, they don't have the transparency where the goods are on offer. So there might be some price comparison platforms that compare the prices, but the Bosch or Samsung, they don't really know who is providing the washing machine, and they can't really provide a single interface to the customer. So if you look at deliveries, yes, there is some track and trace happening, but oftentimes I don't get informed if my delivery window is missed. If I look at the use stage, well, I still have to buy the detergent myself. So there is this German premium washing machine manufacturer that has now cartridges of detergents that are built into the washing machine, and I get notified by the smartphone app if it's time to trigger a replenishment order. And ultimately, and this is already happening for other industries, there might be the case that the product is breaking and is already transmitting information about the parts that might be required for the repair. So really lots of things that are really possible, and we probably have to understand how to use this technology. So let me end here, and maybe I want to share some additional articles later, because we always try to publish some of these topics in practitioner-oriented journals, and I think that could be an interesting read perhaps for you. All right, let me stop sharing my screen, and I hope Pedro is still with me.
I'm here, Kai. Thank you. Thank you so much for your most interesting presentation. A lot of ideas come to me with this presentation. But the biggest takeaway that I take from here is that technology-driven supply chain is not something that you would overlook or to consider that is a future thing. It is already here, but also with it, I do believe that it is not only sufficient to have the technology at stake. You need to have the ability to generate, to gather, to process the data, and to make out of this data information that can actually be of service for your management responsibilities. But I would like to start with something a little bit more holistic at this time, that you actually mentioned on the beginning, or in the beginning of your presentation, which was a quote that you had from Elon Musk, on which he said that supply chain stuff is really tricky. And it is, believe me, because you are a professor in it. You know, of course, I'm a professional of within the supply chain. And I think that Elon Musk should know a thing or two about supply chain, considering that he is responsible, as you've mentioned, for one of the most popular electric vehicles that we have in the world. And he will be probably the responsible for putting the first man on the moon in the long run. So considering that these products have thousands or even hundreds of thousands of parts provided by hundreds or thousands of providers spread around the world, I am sure that he actually knows a bit about logistics. But I believe that he meant that if on a regular functioning supply chain, there are always risks to account for, in a crisis situation, and I seen an interview of him speaking about things that went wrong during the production of the Model 3 of Tesla, like a provider of his having a plant on fire, okay? But he was mentioning that on a crisis situation, the stakes are considerably higher for the stakeholders, okay? And at this moment, we are going through a pandemic, okay? And this pandemic has shown us all in the most rude and relentless manner just how an unexpected circumstance can substantially affect a highly interconnected and interdependent supply chain, resulting, as we saw on mid first semester 2020, we saw just how it resulted on a major slowing down of several supply chains, and even in some cases, temporarily stoppages of materials flow, and of course, disrupting manufacturing all over the world. We are not out of the all at this moment, but in this aftermath, if I could put it this way, in your opinion, Kai, to which extent does the global supply chain actually is learning from this pandemic in order to gain more resilience nation-wise, economy-wise, and to which extent, Kai, most specifically, can a technology-driven supply chain be better prepared to predict instant consequences of an act of God like this one, okay, and to promptly allow the supply chain to react, to overcome the difficulties and the uncertainty from it of happening.
And I think you address a great point there. I mean, if I look at the past year, I guess I've never seen so much talk about supply chain management in the public press as in these past 15 or 18 months. So starting with toilet paper, ending at semiconductors for cars. So really, I guess it's a very important topic, and increasing the resilience will be fundamental in the future. The question is it something that companies are really willing to invest and spend money on? Because in 2-3 years, this hopefully is over, and any investment into technology for resilience might be considered something that should go away for cost-saving reasons. I hope that's not the case, but I fear that people are forgetting quite quickly. However, there are some technologies, in particular around increasing visibility, that are not too expensive and that are really valuable. So if you look at these GPS trackers, these cheap GPS trackers that you could put into your container, that's certainly one option. However, that's a rather standalone solution. So ideally, you would try to gather real-time data along the entire supply chain based on the different partners that are there. And there are now some software providers that are trying to build networks, to monitor networks, and to highlight potential disruptions. So for example, one of these providers, Resilience, Resilink, they are really trying to help you at mapping your supply chain, understanding potential disruptions based on internet data, about news data that they track constantly. So that's certainly one interesting element. If you think about planning, how to plan for a disruption. So in the middle of the first Corona wave, SAP was making their control tower solution free of charge for many of their users. And they saw rather high adoption rates. So, and based on that, companies were now able to run scenarios. What is going to happen if my supply from supplier X is not coming as scheduled? And I think this is something that has gained a lot of traction, and that is really improving the sales and operations planning process. So I think, yes, there are some technologies out there that help us to increase resilience. But I hope that companies are not forgetting into 3 years once the business returns into a bit of calmer waters.
Thank you, Kai. I am totally in line with you. I think that our memory is quite short for these particular type of bad things, if you can put it like this, and it is a bad thing, of course. But let's hope for the best, that the lessons learned actually allow us to be much more prepared in the forthcoming future whenever something like this actually takes us again. So coming back to the...
If I may, I recalled, I was still a consultant at the time the big financial crisis hit. And we came up with, in 2008, 2009, and we came up with wonderful ways to mitigate the financial crisis and all the consequences there. And now if I look at what you have to do in Corona, it's not too different, right? So it's only 10 years later, 12 years later.
With I would say a significant bigger impact. At that time, actually, the financial crisis took us a lot by surprise, but this one has much more to it. I believe we have sanitary issues around the globe, of course, but considering the issue at stake, supply chain, I do agree with you. Coming back to the technology, In your presentation, Kai, you make several references regarding technologies, some soft, some hard, and some of them I would say being more mature than others, and other ones having bigger value potential than the next. Okay, but all of them somehow having some type of contribution to this new future of an holistic and effective technology-driven supply chain. Okay, we actually know that the pace that we are having today, all digital things continue to accelerate, and with new additional technologies, for which we of course we will be, it will be expected in the forthcoming future. I will be that these new technologies that are appearing today will make themselves an even additionally more valuable contribution for this enormous potential of collecting and processing data to actually provide the necessary information. So looking to the technology landscape that you have shown, Kai, and to many other that comes to my mind at this moment, it seems quite blurry, quite noisy, quite a complex scenario, because we have a lot of technology at stake here. And in fact, we need to choose the right one, because as you mentioned before, financial resources are not limitless. So we need to actually put our bets on the right horses, if I can put it like this. So in your perspective, Kai, which technology trend will matter the most for making the supply chain real competitive, or which investments will make the more sense to massively increase performance and to reach a significant achievement? And having questioned this, is it transversal to all industry, or we should consider different technologies for different industries?
Another great question. So if I look at a current study we are doing with SAP, so SAP did their first digital supply chain study 6 years ago, and there was a lot of enthusiasm and maybe a little bit of hype about all these new technologies and how they can be applied, with many ideas for potential use cases. So last fall, we started with SAP to redo the study, to have a look at the implementation. How far is the implementation? How are applying companies these digital technologies? And we talked to many leading companies there. And ultimately, the progress is not as fast as anticipated. I guess that's not a surprise, right? If you look at all the challenges in terms of technology, in terms of data, in terms of funding, I guess that's not a surprise. So these visions are always very, very enthusiastic. However, what we find is that there are some technologies that now really gain a lot of traction across industries. So maybe not really industry specific, but really across industries. And that's probably all the things around analytics, all the things about IoT, and to a certain extent also the integration of data across different platforms, across different suppliers, so and customers. So really integration of data. So and I guess ultimately we have to be realistic. So we have limited, or companies have limited budgets, and this is not only limited within the supply chain department, but also supply chain is competing with other functions for investments. And what is really critical there is, what is a realistic use case, and what is a realistic business case? We found that so far in our study that really coming up with realistic business cases is fundamental. So having some blurry vision of something that could provide a benefit in 7 years, that's probably not going to get funding. And if it gets funding, the first time budgets are cut, these projects are stopped. So I guess it's really interesting and really important to be realistic there in this respect.
So there is no right answer at this time for this specific question of mine. I do understand, of course, and I think that you actually made a reasonable elaboration on your side. Well, despite it was a question that I actually understood from the first moment. It could not have a straightforward answer, and you have made it quite clear.
And I mean, for some companies, there might be something different. So, for example, if you are really working in warehouses, yes, and you have lots of challenges in warehouses, then some interesting warehousing
straightforward answer, and you have made it quite clear.
And I mean, for some companies, there might. Oops, there was some delay there.
I think with this background noise, I did not catch the last part of your elaboration, but I think that I got your general idea. Thank you very much again, Kai. During your presentation, you have elaborated on strength of machines versus strength of humans regarding demand forecasting and consequently decision making, putting upon the table that the human judgment. I took some notes here. You wrote down human judgment, improvisation, and tacit knowledge as examples, as the ultimate rely on factors to consider for a decision-making process. Okay, if I understood it correctly, the machine should actually process, analyze, provide the necessary information, but the final decision would be on the human side of the equation. In your opinion, Kai, to what extent will be it feasible to keep on relying on the human factor for these particular decision-making processes, with, of course, all of its virtues, okay, but with all of its idiosyncratic essence of a human that we know from experience can lead to inefficiency or to ineffective results, when on the other hand, the world is watching this amazing, staggering growth and power of machine learning algorithms and its capability to qualify the best outcome of a decision-making process?
And that's another great question. So, I mean, ultimately, somebody needs to be responsible for the decisions that are made, right? And we already are observing the first problems there. So there is a rather very smart AI algorithm that is making some great recommendations or great decisions. Let's assume he's making some decisions already. And now something goes wrong. So there is a stock out, production line is down, and somebody is responsible, right? So how do you solve that? You can say, well, it was the computer who made the decision, so the computer is to blame, but perhaps that's not good enough for management. So, and I didn't talk about explainability. So what is a key problem with all these very advanced algorithms is that they are essentially becoming a black box. There are so many variables going in, and so many factors that are being considered, and there's no way to understand how they are considered, how they are weighted. So it's essentially becoming a black box. So now we are at a stage where computers are typically doing very good decisions, but we don't know anymore why they are making these good decisions. What's the logic behind that? And now we are at a stage where, yes, we need to better understand, and the computer needs to explain why he's making this recommendation or this decision. So that's probably one thing. But ultimately, I'm fully with you, Pedro. I guess this logic of recommendation decision will shift further over time. So over time, what we are going to see is that for many of these, in a supply chain context, maybe not so important decisions, because there are millions and millions of them, they are entirely automated, and a focus will shift to the design of the algorithms and the understanding what is going to happen there. So I guess it will take some time. So for many companies, this is the far future. For some companies, that's already for some some more advanced companies, this is already happening. So if you look at Amazon, Amazon has this hands off the wheel project where they say, well, I as a planner, I take the hand off the wheel, I don't interfere. The computer is running automatically. For example, all the pricing at Amazon is done automatically. And based on that, we only really interfere if something is seriously going wrong. And I had the chance to talk to one of the Amazon managers who was driving that. And if you look at the amount of manpower that they use to implement these approaches, we are talking about a few hundred data scientists that were involved over quite a number of years. So Amazon has the capabilities and the resources to do that. They probably also see a return on invest. But if you look at a mid-sized company or even a €1 billion company, that's a different story. You're on mute, Pedro.
Oh, I'm in mute now. I was listening to you, and I was wondering. In fact, these big companies have the resources, the means to be on top of their games and actually maximize the full power of technology in order to guarantee the best results on their supply chain management. But my question following your answer is, will we see the day on which machines will be fully replacing human decision-making, not only for the most elemental stuff, but also for the most complex ones? So said in other words, just how far am I as a supply chain professional of being obsolete in my company? And like me, any other of the supply chain professionals today or tomorrow?
I've asked myself the same question. So is there something to research in the next 20 years before I retire? And I'm still thinking there is. So I think 3-4 years back, there was an interesting, very provocative article by Boston Consulting Group. They called it the death of supply chain management. I think there was in Harvard Business Review, the death of supply chain management. And they really highlighted that, well, it can all be automated. And personally, I think it's very far away for most companies, but we are certainly on the trajectory. So if I think forward 20 years, I could imagine that there's a lot of automation that is happening. That's probably the case. So even in smaller companies, and there we are going to see shifts by the big software providers. So this is nothing that a company can develop themselves, a mid-sized company can develop themselves, but they are going to rely on the software providers. And on the one end, there are the big providers, but there are now also many small providers, very many smallish providers that are really implementing supply chain tools that are becoming very powerful. So I'm not sure if you heard about O9 Solutions. So it's a startup. I would still call it a startup that is offering supply chain planning software, partly as a service. And they just reached the unicorn status. So a supply chain software company valued at more than $1 billion US. I guess that's nothing we could have imagined a couple of years back, right? Where we would say, well, this very valuable startups, they are really focused on the consumer side. But no, that's a supply chain startup. I find that very interesting.
Thank you, Kai. We are rapidly coming down to the final of our discussion. I don't know if João would like to jump in.
Yes,
or if
I would like to open the discussion to the other people attending. I would ask Anna, my colleague Anna Camanho, to help me on this because I cannot see the hands raised, if there are hands raised. But anyone is free to make a question. to Kay or to Pedro. And so I would thank you to think about it. And I would perhaps Marta also can see if someone is raising the hand. I can say that the initial example of Tesla, I remember the problems they had a few years ago with the production logistics and the supply chain. So it was a very good example to start with. Since there is no one asking any question. So
I have one as well. Just to I see that we have 2 or 3 more minutes in the time. If you allow me just to put a quick question to Kai.
Of course. Yes,
thank you.
Please,
thank you very much.
Go ahead.
I think we have 5 more minutes to speak, and this conversation it's quite interesting. Kai, you've mentioned that, of course, that there are some small companies that are trying to make the difference in this technology-driven for the future. But we know that the big companies like Amazon, like Google, like Apple, these guys have the words, have all the means to make a difference. These guys are leading the way, no question about that. But well, I am a logistics provider professional. I work in a Portuguese company, which is of course abroad, but I'm working in Portugal specifically. And I, for my sense and seeing what is happening around me, not only in my company but also in several others, great companies, worldwide companies, also in logistics providing. These guys are of course trying to keep up with this continuously rapidly changing world pace on which we are living in. And of course are making their bets on different technologies like virtual reality tools, IoT, blockchain technology. Our company, in fact, is actually betting on a blockchain project at this moment, cloud computing, big data analytics, etc., etc., etc. But and we are trying to keep our relevance as a logistics provider in the supply chain equation, if I could put it this way. In your opinion, Kai, to which extent will a customer, like an OEM from the industry, someone in the pharma industry or in the consumer products industry, to what extent one of these guys will be willing to outsource end-to-end on its own to a supply chain provider like ourselves, to a logistics provider like ourselves, to outsource the planning, organizing, and implementing of their supply chain to a 5PL in the forthcoming future, if this is possible in your perspective, and what could be the foreseen impacts of it?
Yeah, that's I think the billion-dollar question. That's the billion-dollar question. So I think we've been talking about a concept, supply chain as a service, supply chain management as a service for many years, perhaps 15 or 20 years. There was the idea, well, why don't we also outsource all the planning activities to somebody who really knows about it? And the challenge so far is that companies are still too different. They are still too unique. It's very hard for an outsider to understand what is happening there, what are the resources there, what are the processes there, in order to really manage the supply chain as an external party entirely. And I think that's on the one side. On the other side, there's also the vested interest to keep control. I, as a pharmaceutical company, I would like to take control of certain things. I think there has been now quite some, in terms of transportation, warehousing, logistics service providers have already shown their capabilities, they have shown their expertise. In terms of planning, I guess it's still a journey. I don't think we are there yet. I don't think we are there yet. So honestly, I feel that it will take still quite a bit of time until this trust is established and the customers also let loose of the planning process. But that's my personal opinion, and there might be many other examples that show otherwise. But personally, I feel it's still a bit to go. But ultimately, this supply chain as a service could become reality sooner than I expect.
Thank you, Kai. João, the word is back to you.
Thank you very much. I think the seminar has been very interesting, although I think the shock of the presentation has inhibited the participants of raising questions. But I will ask a question, and I think you've already addressed this issue, but I would like to get some more from you. When do you think the autonomous, both land and flying ones, will be around us?
I'm not an expert. I hope soon, but we have one colleague at KLU who is looking into that, and I think the truck thing should become in some countries rather soon. Maybe not in Germany, because we are a bit more hesitant. But trucks on the highway, I guess it's probably the first thing that is going to happen there before the end of the decade for sure.
I was listening today that Hyundai was expecting to have flying not flying objects, but flying devices, and that could transport people and goods by the end of the decade. Yes, so it's consistent what you're saying, but more ambitious, I guess. I don't think Amazon's distribution that has been done as a pilot has been successful, but we never know the future, of course.
Of course not. And in some countries like India or Dubai, it might be more ambitious. Yes.
Well, if there are no more questions, I would like to thank both Kay and Pedro and Rangel for participating in this webinar. I would also like, I don't think he's with us, but Pedro Amorim, my colleague Pedro Amorim also was very important in selecting and inviting Kay for this seminar. And of course, I would like to thank also my colleague Anna and Marta and their team for putting this together. I apologize for the interruptions by some participants who didn't have the microphone off, but I think this was very interesting for the audience. So I'd like to congratulate and thank both Kay and Pedro for their excellent